Thank you so much. It's lovely to be in virtual Sweden, and everybody's very welcome. It's an honor to be here to talk to you today. And I am going to talk a bit about a project called Assessment of Transversal Skills in STEM, shortened to the ATS STEM, and talk a bit about STEM teachers and an idea of real world learning and what that might be. So, and if you have any questions, please just give them to me at the end or as you go, if there's some facilities, do that. So about me, my name is Dr. Eamon Costello. I'm an associate professor in Dublin City University. And this is DCU. This is my family jumping off the DCU sign. They came into the university one day. And of course, when my family got to come into the university, this was back in 2018 on Mother's Day, March 31st. But for the last couple of years, the university has come to me and my family, and I've just been working from my house, as we all have. So, but normally I work in this building here in Dublin City University on our beautiful campus, one of our campuses we have near the airport and near the sea. So if you ever come to Ireland, please come and visit me in our university. You'll be very welcome. And I work in this slightly ugly and unlovable brown building called the Bia Orpin building. But inside it is a beautiful and lovely place to work. I miss it dearly when I'm in lockdown because I work with a wonderful team of people. And it's called the Bia Orpin building, and it's named after this woman here who is a painter, and her paintings are on the walls in this building when I walk up the stairs into my office every day. And it's quite unusual to have a building named after a woman and a painter. And there's an interesting connection between painting and STEM education. And in our university, there was an initiative called Women on Walls at DCU. And this is an artist here painting a scientist, Marie Maynard Daly, the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in chemistry. And they created this painting and they hung it in DCU. And they created a sequence of these paintings named after famous women in STEM who made an impact in STEM. And you may recognize some of these. Katherine Johnson, for example, she was in the movie Hidden Figures. I don't know if anybody saw that movie. It's a great movie, Hidden Figures, about the space race and the people who contributed to that, Black woman in particular. And there's a lady these are the artists who painted beautiful pictures of the people in STEM. And that there was a video of this. It's if you Google "Women in Walls DCU," you'll find the video, and it's an amazing video about the passion and the power of the artists who were painting these portraits of these people that we wanted to hang in buildings. And it's quite interesting because they wanted to leave a legacy of what, or rather who, we expect to see when we enter particular spaces. And it was very interesting to me to think about the connection between the type of knowledge we value as well, because the art was incredible. And this is one of the women, Kathleen Lonsdale. She was a scientist born in Ireland, and one of our buildings is now named after her. We're renaming buildings in the university after women as well. And our science and biotechnology building is our chemistry and building of chemical science and biotechnology is named after Kathleen Lonsdale. She made key discoveries in X-ray diffraction methods, and she was also a committed pacifist. During World War II, she spent a month in jail because she refused. She was living in England, and she refused to register for civil defence. And she later campaigned after her time in prison for more humane conditions for women in prisons. And she wrote this book, Prison for Women. So it's interesting because who is the real Kathleen Lonsdale? Is it the activist or the scientist? And this is an interesting headline. London has more statues of animals than named women, an audit finds. So this was an interesting thing in London. And something interesting about this is that Well, for a start, it's a lovely picture on this article, but I think there's the headline could be corrected because I would say London has more statues of non-human animals than of named women, because people are animals too. And indeed, this is a male animal here, this depiction of a lion in the picture. So it's quite interesting. And then when I was reading a bit about statues and depictions of people in STEM and different things and displays, I came across, and I said I would include it, even though it's not particularly relevant, but a lovely statue in Sweden that I'm sure Swedish people know about, but it was new to me, so I just thought I'd share it. And there's this lady here, she's in the 1980s, I believe. She's hitting a woman with a handbag, and she's angry about these neo-Nazis. And they made a lady with handbag in Vaxio, Sweden, and Danuta Danielsen, they made a lovely statue of her. So I'm going to talk a bit about the project now after the introduction, a bit of talking about depictions of people. And you may have heard this phrase, decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing education. And decolonization is to me feels like a process of talking about who we depict and why, and what language we use, what statues we use, what pictures we use, our environments, all these things. So this project that I'm going to talk to you a bit about now is it is about transversal skills in STEM, and we aimed to see how we could look at how teachers assess skills digitally with students. And we were looking at transversal skills, which is a broad range of skills, and we wanted to look in particular at what skills students need to teach integrated STEM. So where they use more than one topic in STEM and bring those things together, because most of the definitions of STEM talk about this. And to do this, a very ambitious thing, we worked in a number of countries across Europe, and we received funding from a large Erasmus Plus grant. And we work with wonderful people from Tampere to Hanige, Eva Hartel, and I see Monica Peterson and many others here today. Ireland, Santiago, de Compostela, Belgium, Slovenia, Austria, and Cyprus. And to try and look at this complex thing, the first thing we did some desk-based research where we analyzed literature and policy, and we looked at 4 key areas to get a handle on this big complex topic. And a team of researchers in Dublin City University, with the help of our project partners, with contributions from them also, started looking at a number of topics. And the first thing we looked at was what can we learn from the research about STEM in what is known. And the major implication of this review and synthesis of literature in STEM education, it highlighted the need to scaffold an integrated approach to designing STEM learning activities for students that will develop their core STEM competencies. So it was this idea of an integrated approach and breaking down silos and barriers between subjects. And it's a complex balancing act because students need key skills in the core subject, and how do you relate them to others and so on. So, but there's a lot of research on this. We analyzed over 100 articles. We identified 243 specific STEM skills and competencies, which are classified. We then classified as 8 core STEM competencies, which were collaboration, problem solving, innovation and creativity, critical thinking, disciplinary skills and competences, self-regulation, communication, and metacognitive skills. So these are the 8 broad areas we found across the literature that researchers are looking at. And then we want to look at designing integrated experiences and providing intentional and explicit supports for students to build knowledge and competences in the disciplines and across disciplines. So we want to use appropriate digital tools and resources as well to make sure that students have the disciplinary knowledge first and foremost. So the next report we did was we wanted to look at the policy landscape in Europe, because we wanted to find out what support was there for teachers, for students in teaching, learning, integrated STEM, and what does that look like at a government level? What are governments interested in this idea of integrated STEM and its development in schools? And we found that there was very little policy on integrated STEM from European governments, regional or national, about this topic. But we did find elements of it in some, and there were some countries, Scotland, Netherlands, and Ireland had some policies on STEM, quite mature policy landscapes, and it's a variable landscape across Europe as to how this works. And we found some interesting topics. Social inclusion and equity are one of the key motivational drivers of STEM educational policy, and how these interact with society, particularly industry support and collaborative efforts to engage in partnership, focus on STEM education, and policies for underrepresented groups are discussed in detail in this report. And this was a big thing. A lot of integrated STEM is how it's reflected in policy is through outreach, through collaboration with society, with communities, industry support, and how industry relates to STEM education is very interesting. And indeed, in the previous report that came through as well. So as I said, 4 of the 8 countries we studied had explicit policies relating to STEM. And some of them targeted underrepresented groups. Another report we did was on digital formative assessment of transversal skills in STEM. The incorporation of technology into formative assessment. And we characterized this as a means to an end and not a goal in its own right. So it's something that we were looking at practices where there was some increase in student learning. We tried to find this in studies, and the validity is of any approach. It doesn't increase student learning. This report suggests it is compromised if that's not the case. And this was a very interesting report, and we found formative assessment to be a dynamic process involving elicitation and interpretation of evidence that will be used by learners and their teachers to make decisions about next steps in their learning. And it inherently requires an understanding of instructional goals, the knowledge of skills to be learned, students' current progress in reaching those goals, and what students must do to close the gap between their current attainment and the end goals. And feedback was obviously a critical component in formative assessment. What will students do with this feedback when they get it? How are they using it, and so on? And students and teachers must have the time to invest in these technologies. So a key principle for formative assessment we found was that if it doesn't support student learning, then it can't be said to be valid for first intended purposes. And this validity came through very strongly in this report about evaluating effectiveness of digital tools. And this is just such a rapidly growing area. So you can read more about all the different types of inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning, collaborative learning, mobile learning, the big trends that we identified in this report. The next report was about virtual learning environments, and we characterized 9 of these, and we did an analysis of those and to understand the affordance of dimensions of them. And this, since the pandemic, this is a growing area, and platforms are massive and are so influential. We looked, this is a broader study where we looked at architectures and platforms. And we wanted to look at ones that were specifically designed for assessment purposes, such as e-items, comparative computer adaptive testing, classroom response systems, obviously very big, and the affordances of these. And then we tried to synthesize all of the research we had found in these 4 reports into a framework. We want to tie all these concepts together and give something practical to teachers and translate this back from theory into practice. So we published this report called Towards the ATS STEM Conceptual Framework. And it was trying to attain a final solution greater than the sum of its parts and give educators and teacher educators a map where they could look at all this territory and say, right, I am interested in problem solving. Where can I find a tool that I can use in my class to do that? How should I go looking for that tool? What does that tool give me? What are the affordances of that tool? What types of tool are there? How does that tool relate to assessment? What do I need to do in assessment? What does feedback look like? What do learning outcomes and intentions, sharing those? How can I get feedback on, how can I measure the progress of students and communicate that, and so on. So we wanted to try and create a big map into this very complex area of all these topics. So we put everything together, the syntheses of the report, and we created this conceptual framework. And it looks something like an octopus or something here, many headed hydra. And in the middle, we have integrated STEM topics, which are also learning outcomes. That was kind of the core thing we tried to focus on, right? We want an integrated STEM topic or learning outcome that anchors everything. The key features of digital assessment, core STEM competencies, STEM learning design principles, and the key features of formative assessment. So we have these 4 elements, and then they all have sub-elements. So within this, so I've kind of given you a lightning overview of some of the things in this project, because it's a very big project with a lot of elements. But you can find more about these topics, and I'll talk a bit more now about them. But if there's any of these areas is particular of interest to you, just please go to our website, atsstem.eu, and the resources link there. You'll find these reports if they're of interest to you, and you can find our Twitter account there as well, or you can find me on my Twitter there and follow me and ask me a question or link up with me that way. So this is the core element of our framework here, and this to encapsulate the key ideas from the literature. And this framework we were hoping would have the potential to inform and deepen people's understanding of what STEM education is, and shape and scaffold their classroom practice. And they could find ways into it and find best practices in there. But we also started to develop this out, and we developed this into a series of learning designs and lesson planning tools we could give for people to enact pedagogical designs in their classrooms. And I'll just jump into a little bit of the framework here, show you what this looks a bit like in practice. And so one of the elements here is STEM learning design principles. That's one of the things. And within those principles, there's various principles here. And one of them is real world context. And this is, there were 74 papers we looked at. It talked about the importance in STEM of real world context. And it's a big, interesting topic in educational research, and the examples and the context you give students that you're putting the lessons and the learnings in, very, very relevant. And how do we assess authentic STEM skills with these real world contexts? So this is the framework. When we started this project, it was before the pandemic, and all of a sudden we were just all working from home, all the great plans we had. And these are some learning design cards, physical cards we had with elements of the framework that teachers can use. They can use them like this. They can put them out, lay them out here on a grid, and help design their lessons in iterative ways. And they do this in cycles. And here's an example, for example, setting the context, to talk about real world context. And we have definitions of these on the cards drawn from the report. So say what does real world context mean? Well, this is a STEM learning design principle that connects the subject matter to real life and makes learning more meaningful to students. Other principles can refer to real world context and develop integrated STEM tasks. And then we have some things here, setting the context. We tried to link with the SDGs, the UN sustainability goals here. This was our real a key thing to pin this into real world context, to say, right, what are the goals? What are the goals people have? What should lessons be centered around? And these are thought to be some of the main challenges we face. So there's a teacher here. She's filling out her context with a lesson design and a sense of space. Her sustainable development goal is good health and well-being, a sense of space, using pictures, maps, and models, human environments, natural built environment features, and people. And this is an example from a school in Slovenia, and they're using some elements of the framework here about problem solving, discussing real world problems related to SDGs, finding solutions, trialing solutions, assessing solutions, and discussing solutions with the student according to the learning cycle. And this one is about beavers in the Hanige stream. And one of our students, our teachers, was presenting at a networking event, and we held these networking events with all our teachers from across Europe, and they were hugely valuable for teachers to present with each other from across Europe. I think it gave teachers a real sense that they were part of something bigger, and particularly when we were in various stages of lockdown, to feel connected, feel part of Europe, but also a great sense of pride in their work and what they were doing with their students in their local environments. And really the key thing was they were mapping back their lessons to their local context, which was very important. And defining real world problems related to SDGs. This is another example from this is actually slightly out of order. This is from an Irish school, but integrating digital tools. This is part of the framework that asks about, you want to use formative digital assessment strategies. Which digital tools do you use? A checklist here for teachers. About sharing learning intentions, classroom discussions, giving and using feedback, and peer and self-assessment, trying to encourage them to use that. And this is an example from a school in Cyprus, and they were designing their school yard. They used that as their project, and it was interesting. They wrote a letter to their school board, the students, to see could they redesign their yard. And it was another nice example of a real world activity of students being empowered to affect change in their own environment, direct environment. These are some lovely students from one of the schools in Sweden working on this project, and they're looking at a recycling bin and did an amazing project of taking photographs in this recycling bin every day and analyzing the data from that bin using digital tools to see what was being recycled and have an impact in their local area. And I think there was a news media item on them. And this is an example from Ireland, from one of our teachers in a school in rural Ireland. And they did a project on their schoolyard. They wanted to create a sensory garden in their school, and they did a project on native trees, and they took a number of topics and integrated them. Mathematics and numeric skills they used to plan a garden, and they had to design, and they also used art to design the trees, and they were using elements of biology to identify trees and tree types. And we did a large assessment of this as well. This is going on in all the countries. We did field trials of this work. We had our colleagues in Compostela, the Santiago University Compostela. They led out on the research and developed with the project as a whole a set of tools to elicit evidence of STEM skills in students, and whether working with the teachers we could find any improvement in these skills, such as problem solving and all of the skills from the framework. So my colleagues in Ireland were Colette and Lily and myself were involved in this research here, working with 2 case study schools in Ireland and doing in-depth interviews with teachers, with mentors, with students, and getting qualitative and quantitative feedback from them. And it was very interesting, these workshops with these people, to try and understand the framework and its application. There was a very diverse picture of technology levels across and even within countries. And it's a very practical issue when we're trying to develop anything that's scalable and replicable, because any kind of tools we wanted to use some kind of standard tool and use this in every school. It's just not possible. And even tools themselves are not even reliable. Digital tools, particularly nowadays, they can change. The cloud-based tools, while they're very powerful, they're also hosted. They can be changed. There's many variables. So we were recommending selecting tools that were multifunctional and consider both teachers and student perspectives, and ones that they're familiar with, to reduce training and facilitate the integration of many digital assessment strategies. Interdisciplinarity, this integrated nature, it was easier in primary schools, obviously, than secondary schools. And it was a challenge trying to get teachers to talk to each other to see could we integrate STEM to different topics together. And at the policy level, we found in this evaluation that there is a need for structured support for scaffolding digital assessment practices across Ireland, and awareness and consideration of the key challenges. So some of the things we found, like digital complexity, device access, internet access, complexity for teachers, and platformization, which is a term you might be familiar with or not, but platformization is about the huge growth it's a term to refer to the huge growth in the use of things like Microsoft Teams, Google Classroom, all these things in schools, and they are becoming deeply embedded now, or other platforms you'd be aware of from your own context. And there's both good and bad elements to this. And in particular, there's a lot of elements with students' data and how we're using that. But the other thing about it was the digital complexity of trying to do things with students. And some of the really successful practices we saw with teachers were also with low-tech tools, or with being able to intentionally use technology and then drop technology when it wasn't working. And one of the very interesting things about many of the projects that the teachers engaged in was in outdoor learning. And it could be the case where they're using devices outdoors, or sometimes they're just not using devices outdoors, or out drawing or doing something outside, and then bring it into the classroom, digitizing that, uploading it to a VLE, or using Kahoot or Mentimeter or some digital tool to base a lesson with a digital element around that offline, unplugged, outdoor activity. And this is particularly useful in the pandemic. And there's countries like in Scandinavia, for example, that are ahead of Ireland when it comes to outdoor learning. We have a lot to learn about outdoor learning from countries like in the Scandinavian region and Canada. Colder countries. There was some very interesting things about collaboration versus cooperation. A lot of digital tools are premised upon they're premised upon gaming. They're what's the word I'm looking for? Competition. That should actually say competition versus cooperation. A lot of tools that students really enjoyed using have this gamified element, and students love the social cues of working with each other and competing against each other. This idea of mimetic desire, that you desire the thing that somebody else desires. So human beings are intensely social creatures, and we take our cues from others. And this competitive and fun game aspect is very interesting. But some of the teachers there was a teacher in Santiago in particular who did some very interesting work with students and tried to turn this around to be able to show students as well the value of collaboration in reaching these shared goals. Because many of these projects we talk about as well, where students are having a big impact in their school or their environment, it's hard to relate that back to the individual contribution, ability, skill of one student. And a lot of what we do in education is quite obsessive about individual skills and competencies. Rightly so. It's hard to get away from it. It's vitally important, really important. But shared outcomes and bigger outcomes are also important. So it's a difficult one. Interesting one. And I guess one of the things about this as well was that one of the things we found in all this work, and that was apparent to me very clearly, was this idea of feedback literacy. And research ed itself is an example of this, because a lot of the assessment literature research talks about cultures of assessment, building cultures of assessment and feedback, and this idea of teacher feedback literacy and its interplay with student feedback literacy. And the notion of feedback and assessment is just becoming more and more rich, and people are becoming more and more skilled and conversant in all these aspects of it, in the ideas of learning outcomes, of sharing them, of learning intentions, of when to share them, of how to share them, of clarifying expectations, which allows student teachers much more confidence to build and plan complex lessons based on these ideas, and to be constantly interrogating learning outcomes with students. I shouldn't say interrogating, exploring them as to how much they're met, how they're not, why, and so on. And giving clarity around all these things, and using digital technologies or not to do this. And even things like peer assessment, for example, some of the projects uses students using peer assessment. And this is a difficult thing. This comes back to competition versus collaboration. It's hard for people to figure out peer assessment. How does it work? How come, we're assessing each other? What does that mean? And that's about increasing students' feedback literacy, which is very powerful and gives students a real insight into what they're learning. And I guess one of the things that I was trying to talk about as well was this idea of real world learning is very interesting, because the interplay of the real world, this is one of the things in literature. Use the real world in examples with students. It'll be much more rich and enlivening and everything else. And that is very true. But there's also the notion of creativity and our imagination. And, that is real as well, our imagination and creativity to build and transform. And this is a quote from one of our students. Some of them know, like one of our, one is a quote from one of our teachers in Ireland about the trees. And she said, some of them know like 10 times more than me about trees and birds, and about, like, they're just amazing. Some of them are amazing. Like the 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, I was probably asking two of the boys, are we sure this is the hazel? The one that I didn't know. And he was like, I'm sure. I'm able to describe exactly. He was able to describe exactly why he knew it was the hazel. And I identify this because I love trees, but I find it very difficult to identify the different trees and remember which is which. And this student had this local real world knowledge and was able to help the teacher with it. And this was kind of going on during the pandemic, and there's a lot of research that's come out during the pandemic. In case you haven't seen any of it, if I'm talking to any teachers out there, this is a big report that came out of Australia, Perceptions of Australian Schooling in 2021. And this was during lockdown. People like teachers. People trust teachers. People think teaching is intellectually demanding work. And, parents are answering these surveys. This research has been replicated with similar studies in Ireland. Teachers are hugely valued, and even more so now. and teaching. It's hugely in the focus, because what happens in schools isn't a black box anymore, and teachers realize that they're not. Parents realize they're not teachers. They don't know how this stuff works. And I guess this quote from Gert Bestia I just introduced here as well, which is, I think, is useful at this juncture, which is, the point of education is not that students learn. So this is perhaps quite controversial, because I know we're supposed to be talking about learning and its evidence and all this. But he goes on to say, I wish to suggest that the point of education is that students learn something, and they learn it for a reason, and they learn it from someone. So these are kind of key things. And they speak to putting teachers back at the heart of education as well. And the other thing that was interesting about the calls to use real world examples, and sometimes this is kind of, and a lot of, back to the policy reports in the start of this, where we looked at the links between industry and STEM, and getting people to know what happens in industry and what the real value of studying STEM and learning it is, and what it can do, and these real world examples of people using STEM in industry. It one of the things we need to be careful is not to think that industry is somehow amazing. And I'm going to use the example of Netflix and Amazon and all these companies. People may think they're the gold standard and we could learn from them or be more like Netflix and Amazon and Apple and all these things. But I think there's also the counterpoint needs to be made that teaching is itself authentic real world activity. It is a real site of in and of itself. Teaching and learning are inherently good and useful activities that help people grow and develop. So that is a very elaborate and elongated and hopefully vaguely coherent overview of our project. And you can find out more at our website, on Twitter, and thanks to the Erasmus Plus, our funders, and all our wonderful project partners,